I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about how important are genes for ADHD? Over the last 40, 50 years, progressed from noting family aggregations that ADHD seems to run in families to doing twin and adoption studies, which showed a very considerable genetic contribution in the range of heritability being about 0.75 to 0.8 for ADHD. So in the same range that genes contribute to the height of each individual, the genetic risk for schizophrenia, it's bigger than most studies find for depression or a host of other conditions of the body or brain. A few decades back, where we were hoping to find genes like dopamine transporters or receptors or things that we thought were part of the causation of ADHD, and that defective genes in those systems would help us find a quick and easy key to ADHD. Most of those have not panned out, and the recent emphasis over the last decade plus has been on overall polygenic genetic load or polygenic risk score. So that's summing hundreds, usually thousands of genes, each of which are having a tiny, tiny effect. And we can see if you develop a scale of which genes may have individually tiny, tiny risks, cumulatively some substantial risk, who may be more at risk. It's not a test that you can run, and it doesn't have high predictive value, but in terms of asking research questions as to how much genes are contributing, how much environment is contributing, what's the interaction, and what's the interaction between predispositions, that can be informative. And that's what some of the most recent studies are investigating. It wasn't until the late 70s that ADHD actually entered the official DSM criteria, clearly recognized years before that, but that began a period of great research and interest. 70s, 80s, early 90s, the dogma was kids have ADHD and all of them outgrow it. End of story. Adults didn't have it. But clinicians started noticing that kids who they were treating, parents would show up late to pick up their kids, or would not remember to give them their medications, or would mess up on remembering instructions for detailed psychological interventions, behavioral interventions. And then they did genetic studies looking at both twins. So twins are used in genetics because identical twins have the same DNA. Non-identical twins only share 50% of their DNA. They're only as genetically connected as siblings, brothers, sisters, to each other. So if you see different rates of concordance, of agreement between a trait in identical versus non-identical twins, that gives you some indication of how strongly genetically influenced this trait is. And also adoption studies. You can look at kids who have ADHD who were brought up by their own biological parents. You can look at kids with ADHD who were brought up by non-biological parents. You can look at ADHD parents adopting kids. Interestingly, kids with ADHD are more likely to end up in the adoption process. That's connected to parents with ADHD are more likely to start having sex at early ages, start having more impulsive sex, and are more likely to wind up with a kid before they are ready to take care of a kid. Studies showed a kind of heritability of about 0.75 to 0.8. There were a few exceptions. So one exception is if you did the study asking people about their own diagnosis of ADHD, their heritability rates were lower, considerably lower. This seems to be an artifact of many, particularly late adolescents, young adults, being inaccurate in their own history reporting as to whether they've been diagnosed or not. That doesn't seem to be all shame related and purposely hiding it. At a larger level, concerns being raised about identical twins may not just share more, they absolutely share more of their DNA, but they may also have a more similar environment. But also important to emphasize, this is not a completely 100% genetically determined trait. Again, mostly a few decades back, there was a lot of enthusiasm starting looking at small families where ADHD was transmitted over generations and identifying certain genes, particularly dopamine receptors, dopamine transporters. Some of them looked at serotonin transporters, synaptic vesicle proteins that were involved. There was suggestion, maybe this gene is important for ADHD. And maybe in some lineages, some families, such genes have a significant role in conveying the risk of who gets ADHD or not. But when you start looking at bigger population levels, virtually all of these genetic mutations did not seem to have an important role. So from that era, we've moved on to much more what are called genome-wide association studies, chopping up all the DNA in your body with special enzymes that target specific genetic sequences and looking at the different sizes of the proteins. And that can give us an indication of shared genetic traits and who has a different mutation, a different form at a different location. Big population of people, if you look at the pattern of different genes that are represented in a certain trait, so people with ADHD or a certain degree of ADHD, it's more powerful actually looking at continuum. So if you correlate degree of ADHD with presence of a certain gene, you can come up with a polygenic risk score, which again weighs each tiny, tiny little genes. But overall, you can come up with a score of how your ADHD load or your ADHD genetic risk. So again, that's called a PRS. You retest it in the second population to make sure that you weren't just making random mistakes or problems and showing that your risk score really does correlate with who has ADHD or trait or correlates with the strength of traits in that population. No big gene is jumping out as having a strong predictive value. No individual single gene is having a strong predictive value across the population for inheriting ADHD. The polygenic risk scores do seem, again, to be doing some decent job of capturing some of the genetic propensity, but clearly they are not capturing that whole 75%, 80% heritability factor. So we are still missing some substantial genetic contributors. Polygenic risk score is based on, we think, on coding DNA. So that these are genes that code for specific proteins. And a lot of our DNA also includes regulatory regions. You can have genetic mutations in regulatory regions. You can also have copy number variants, so chunks of DNA that are either deleted, so repetitive chunks that are either repeated a certain number of times or deleted a certain number of times. The most recent study that I'm going to go into in a little more detail was a Danish study. They looked at 30,000 individuals. They had assays done on their genomes so they could look at how high they scored on the ADHD polygenic risk score. They did studies to look at who was diagnosed with ADHD in this population, or they had records to see who was diagnosed with ADHD or not. And they looked at 24 different risk factors which have been associated with ADHD, like parental age, some more sociologic factors. Did these risk factors that have been shown in other populations show up in this population? So, were things like epilepsy, low birth weight, low mother and father age, low income associated at all with the risk of being identified with ADHD? And they found that for most of the things that had been, again, identified in other studies, they were risk factors. And then they looked at each of these 24 factors to see how many of those were correlated with the genetic load, with the polygenic risk score for ADHD that had been developed. About half of those risk factors were associated, the other half weren't. So what does that mean? So a factor like epilepsy. So epilepsy, having a diagnosis of epilepsy in a kid was about 2.3 times more likely that kid is going to have ADHD. But this study did not find any association between epilepsy and the polygenic risk score for ADHD, the genetic loading. So that says that something like epilepsy appears to be a separate independent pathway from your genetic risk for ADHD for developing ADHD. So presumably that repeated seizures are having some transformative impact on the brain, which is causing the brain to develop in an ADHD-like way. Half the factors, though, that they had found, again, these are factors that were associated with ADHD. The ones they found that were also associated with the genes, the polygenic risk factor for ADHD were things like small for gestational age. So if you were born much smaller than expected, given how long you stayed in the womb, the mom's autoimmune status, how many infections, multiple infections. Again, these are from hospital records that the kid had in the early years of life, traumatic brain injury in the kid. And then a host of social factors were also found associated, again, not just with ADHD diagnosis, but with ADHD genetic load or genetic propensity. So things like low income, father's low income, mother's low income, low educational level of father and mother, whether the kid was raised in a single parent family, how young, mother or father under the age of 20 when child was born was a strong indicator for ADHD, and again, was strongly linked with genetic risk factor. So for these group of factors, genetic load risk for ADHD predicted or was associated with all these socioeconomic factors, and that there wasn't a further interaction. We've known low socioeconomic status is associated with ADHD. Is that causing or directly contributing to ADHD separate from genetics? And again, this study suggests the opposite, that there's some common collection of genetic loading or factors, and that if you have this genetic load, you are both likely to not finish school or to start having kids early. For most of these factors, they didn't support that the risk factor itself was causing or contributing in a different way other than the common upstream genetic loading. So there was at least one factor where they found a clear interaction. There were a few others with suggestive interactions. So the mother's autoimmune status, if mother had autoimmune diseases, particularly during pregnancy, kids were more likely to have ADHD. Not only were genetic factors making it more likely, the interaction suggests that there's also some contribution of the mother's autoimmune condition to the kid's development of ADHD. Suggestive that maybe traumatic brain injury and a few other things were in this category, and possibly with much larger studies, larger numbers of people, the statistics would more robustly show that. So the big take-home message, one is the idea that I have a bad dopamine receptor, bad gene for packing synaptic vesicles. Pretty clearly not that simple. Pretty clearly many genes are each having a tiny role. And clearly, the environmental factors are having a role as well. Two, that these are giving us some ideas, so where it may be productive to study. So I hope this wasn't too confusing or too disappointing.